Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you've had lunch, and it was a good one. I'm Linda Walton. I'm a chaplain on campus here, one of the co-advisors of the Utah Valley Interfaith Club. And I have the pleasure today of introducing our speakers, and then they're going to go for it. I'm not going to bug them at all. You don't get bothered until the next hour. Okay? So, John Moorhead, on my far right, is the custodian for the evangelical chapter of the Foundation for Religion Diplomacy and the director of the Western Institute for Intercultural Studies. Wow, that's quite a title. I like that. Very much an author and has been involved in interreligious relationships and conversations in the different contexts of Islam, Mormonism, paganism, so quite a variety. We're glad to have you here. The other gentleman is Chris Stedman, and he is the Assistant Humanist Chaplain at Harvard University and the Values and Action Coordinator for the Humanist Community at Harvard. Again, he has been an author on many occasions, and he is an atheist that is working to foster positive and productive dialogue and collaborative actions between faith communities and the non-religious. And so this time, have you decided who's going to be first? John? Chris is going to be first? Okay, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. We're going to save the best for last, so I'll go first. So I just want to get one thing out of the way right away, just to be clear about this, make sure we're all on the same page. So just give me 1 second, okay? All right. I, Chris Stedman, am an atheist. I'm going to let that settle in for a minute. Is everyone okay? If you need to leave, it's okay. I understand. No? We're all still here? All right, let's do this then. So, as I said, my name is Chris Stedman. I'm an atheist, and I participate in interfaith efforts. And just a little bit of background about me and where I'm coming from. I grew up actually in a non-religious household. I would describe it more as irreligious than anything. I never heard the word God growing up, but I didn't hear the word atheist either. But when I was around 11 years old, that changed. I had a really significant religious experience and had a conversion, became a born-again Christian when I was 11. There were sort of two primary reasons why that conversion happened. The first is that about a year prior, I started reading books like Roots, Hiroshima, The Diary of Anne Frank. These were books that not only increased my awareness of some of the greatest atrocities that have occurred throughout human history, but they also told the story of what it was like for those who experienced these events. And so as a 10-year-old, as much as any 10-year-old can, I was asking some really difficult questions about meaning and purpose and suffering and justice. And I was looking for some answers to those questions. And then about a year later, when I was 11, my parents separated and my family dynamic changed overnight. And some friends invited me to go to a non-denominational Christian after-school youth group. And right away, I found my need for community fulfilled by this group. And I found that they provided some answers to the questions that I had. But just a few months later, I realized that I was attracted to people of my same gender. And this community had very strict prohibitions against homosexuality and were very vocal in their position on this. So I really struggled to find my place in that community for some time. Eventually, when my mother found a journal that I was keeping where I was detailing the experience I was going through, she took me to speak with a Christian minister who offered me an alternate perspective on sexuality, and I continued to be involved in Christian spaces until I went to college. I went to college to study religion, thinking that I would want to work perhaps as a Christian minister. And when I got to college, my Christian professors encouraged me to look not only at my initial conversion experience and ask myself why it was I had become a Christian in the first place, but they really encouraged me to take a critical look at all of my beliefs and ask myself what the foundation was for what I believed. And when I realized that for me, becoming a Christian had been much less about the metaphysical commitments of the tradition and much more about looking for a place to belong and looking for a sense of justice in a world that seemed very unjust, and that the theological claims of Christianity had never sat quite as comfortably with me. They were something that I kind of took on as a package deal along with those aspects of Christianity. When I realized that was the case, I decided that I didn't believe any longer. And yet, at first for me, being an atheist meant, being very sort of rejecting towards the idea of faith, but also towards religious people more generally. And I found that made it difficult for me to have conversations with people of faith, to understand where they were coming from, to get a sense of what they cared about, and perhaps what our intersecting convictions might be. And so eventually I came across this idea of interfaith work, but to me initially as an atheist, interfaith was a very strange proposition. From the beginning I was not at all interested in certain expressions of interfaith. There's no place for me as an atheist in something like interfaith worship, where people come together and say, though we come from different traditions, we sort of worship the same God or creator or life force or what have you. I mean, as an atheist, that doesn't really represent my worldview. I would sometimes hear people say in interfaith contexts that, the one thing that sort of binds us is a belief in God, or at least that all people present are people of faith. And, that obviously didn't connect for me and doesn't for many atheists. And so as an atheist, I believe that the need for truly honest, truly inclusive interfaith work is urgent. I wouldn't claim to speak on behalf of the atheist community, which is incredibly diverse, but for me, as someone who does not believe that any supernatural or divine forces will intervene in human affairs, will intercede on behalf of humans to work for justice, I believe that it is up to us. I believe that this is the only life that I will have, that there is no life for me after I die, and for me, it prioritizes the importance of trying to find common ground in spite of some of the ways in which interfaith can sometimes feel exclusive to non-religious people. In addition to being an atheist and a naturalist, I'm also a humanist, and for those of you who don't know, humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that without supernaturalism or belief in God affirms our individual ability and responsibility to lead a life of personal fulfillment that aspires to the greater good of all humanity. There's a rich tradition of humanist thought and philosophy, and I sort of situate myself within these humanist ideals. And for me, the most important part of what humanism is that it aspires for the greater good for all people. That means that I need to push myself as an atheist to strive to better understand those who are not like me. I'm someone who aspires to make decisions informed by reason and motivated by compassion, and as such, it strikes me as both pragmatically and ethically important to participate in and promote religious pluralism and interfaith understanding. And yet, my foundation for promoting pluralism doesn't just come from a place of sociological pragmatism or from my humanistic optimism that humanity can realize its great potential and work together across boundaries of religion and other such social categories. It also comes from a place of deep dissatisfaction with the way that the world is, and a recognition that human tribalism needs to be transcended by humans, that even when it seems impossible, we have to put in the effort. This is why, as an atheist, I'm frequently frustrated by the most common and visible expressions of atheism in our culture today. For example, just last night, Richard Dawkins, a very famous public atheist, tweeted, I haven't read the Quran, so I couldn't quote chapter and verse like I can for the Bible, but I often say Islam is the greatest force for evil today. As brilliant as Dawkins is, and as correct as I think he is about many things, comments like these smack of a lack of charity, a lack of imagination, and a lack of willingness to see the humanity in another group of people. I understand the frustrations that many atheists feel toward exclusivistic religious voices in the public square. As a queer person, for example, I too feel frustrated by efforts that seek to inhibit my freedom in the name of religious morality. But it is far too simplistic to only focus on those efforts without acknowledging the advocacy for my freedom that is also done in the name of religion. And it represents an unwillingness to work with religious believers to help some of them understand where I am coming from. But even among those atheists who would take issue with Dawkins' remarks on Twitter, there is still a lingering question, and it is one that I get from fellow atheists a lot, and that is, why do we need interfaith efforts specifically? The argument goes, atheists work with believers every day, at work, in school, when volunteering. So why are interfaith efforts valuable? In addition to sharing my personal story, because in the words of Marshall Gans, storytelling is how we communicate our values with one another, I lay out 4 primary reasons in my book, Faithiest, for why I think atheists should participate in interfaith work. And that is that atheists are a minority group in a society that frequently assumes religious identification and belief in God, that many atheists are opposed to religious extremism and want to combat its influence in our society, that many atheists value education and that interfaith dialogue is an inherently educational endeavor. And finally, that atheists are a widely marginalized and misunderstood community in the United States. I'm not going to go in depth into those arguments today, but I would like to share an example that from my experience facilitating workshops on atheism and religious diversity at colleges and universities that I think is particularly insightful in this respect. So often I'll visit a college or a university and I'll give a workshop on atheism and religious diversity. And at these workshops, one of the first things that I'll do is ask participants what words or phrases come to mind when they hear the word atheist. And I'll say, okay, I know you know that I'm an atheist, but just be honest with me, tell me what you think, and we'll go from there. And even at particularly secular liberal universities, the connotations with the word atheist are almost exclusively negative. When I ask why, participants generally cite 2 things. First, personal interactions they've had with self-righteous atheists, and second, media messages from and or about atheists that leave the impression that we are untrustworthy and unlikable. And a number of studies that have been done in recent years confirm this. They verified the fact that atheists are among the most distrusted groups in the United States. Interfaith contexts present an opportunity to challenge atheism's negative connotations because when atheists and people of faith meet face to face, preconceived stereotypes inevitably reveal their flaws. We then gain allies who return to their own communities and mobilize their friends and allies. Interfaith contexts provide an opportunity for atheists to challenge their ideas about people of faith as well. Interfaith engagement is unique because it puts religious differences to the forefront. People can no longer be tokenized as the atheist neighbor who happens to be a good person, unlike those other atheists, or the religious friend who happens to be intelligent and well-read, unlike the rest of those religious people. Instead, with our beliefs at the forefront, we demonstrate not only our shared values and a sense of common humanity, but we help to legitimize our communities in the eyes of others. Of course, an atheist involved in interfaith efforts will have to grapple with what attitude he or she wants to take toward the religious beliefs of participants. This is something that I myself have had to grapple with. In that vein, it has been suggested by some of my fellow atheists that interfaith work asks non-believers, and really all participants, to put their beliefs aside in order to get along. This is something that is of deep concern to many atheists and to many evangelicals as well. In fact, I think that the challenges of bringing atheists and evangelicals into interfaith spaces share many parallels. To speak for myself, I will say that the pursuit of truth matters to me. I believe, personally, that a naturalistic worldview that prioritizes scientific skepticism provides the best lens to consider our world. I have often relished debates about the legitimacy of religious claims. My worldview includes a commitment to critical inquiry. For example, in Faithiest, I write about a conversation I had with a professor when I was studying religion as a master's student, who urged me to consider using the word God when talking about justice. She argued for its symbolic weight, but I couldn't sacrifice my own intellectual integrity. Ideas and words, as far as I'm concerned, have consequences, and I try to speak from my own truth whenever possible. Still, I think it is worth asking, when atheists or people of faith advocate for something that we think is true, what is our underlying goal? What kind of world are we working toward? Is there enough value in persuading people out of their religion or into another one if this change in their beliefs doesn't also change their approach to other important questions? It seems to me that I have more in common with someone who believes in God and also values social progress and human rights than I do with an atheist who believes that women are inferior to men, or that not all people deserve equal access to education, or that, as prominent atheist Sam Harris has said, eliminating religion would be better than eliminating rape. Some atheists argue that the best way to fight injustice is by opposing religion, claiming that a world without religion would be a more just one. This argument is often supported with a quote from theoretical physicist Steven Weinberg, who said, "With or without it, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion." This idea neglects to account for the fact that religion has been cited as the source of both good and bad actions, and it is an overly simplistic assessment of a complex issue. Basically, good people do evil, or at least morally questionable, acts all the time, often without any religious influence at all. In our contradictions and our failings, we can find common ground in our utter humanity. Even for atrocities that seem to be religiously motivated, the data suggests that people's motivations are complex. Research by social psychologists at the New School for Social Research and the University of British Columbia found that prayer to God, an index of religious devotion, was unrelated to support for suicide attacks. Instead, they found that attending religious services positively predicted support for suicide bombing because it builds coalitional commitment. But this same phenomenon of building coalitional commitment is present in more secular groups. For example, Sri Lanka's nationalistic, non-religious Tamil Tigers have used similar mechanisms to recruit support for suicide bombings, and they are responsible for more suicide bombings than any other group since the 1980s globally. According to Dr. Robert Pape, director of the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism, where religious forces do become most relevant is in demonizing the enemy and building out-group hostility. This supports the idea that humanizing religious diversity, which is one of the primary goals of interfaith dialogue, is vitally important in our globalized world today. Thus, I am skeptical of the claim that atheists should focus on bringing about an end to religion. Instead, I think that atheists should work with religious allies to directly tackle the very real problems of authoritarianism, rigid tribalism, and social pressure, and focus on promoting open dialogue and access to education. In one discussion around Faithiest, shortly after its release, a commenter suggested that eliminating ignorance is more important than eliminating injustice or suffering, and that eliminating a particular ignorance, if eliminating a particular ignorance resulted in greater suffering, it would still be a net positive. I cannot bring myself to agree with that. You see, I think a commitment to knowledge is important, but it is not the only important commitment. In a world full of suffering and splintered by religious disagreements, I think we should sometimes prioritize the pursuit of justice over the pursuit of philosophical agreement, especially because hostile arguments over matters of truth frequently do little more than convince all involved of their own correctness. In the face of hostility, few people become more open. More often than not, we become defensive. You can be honestly and strongly critical of other people's beliefs or doctrines while acknowledging each individual's right to his or her own personal beliefs, even if they seem irrational or misplaced to you. To quote another famous atheist by the name of Christopher Hitchens, "I would like to propose a pact with the faithful. As long as you don't want your religion taught to my children in school, given a government subsidy, imposed on me by violence, any of these things, you are fine with me." This kind of attitude creates space for atheist religious cooperation on important matters while also allowing everyone to be honest about their disagreements. I'm more concerned about whether someone shares my core values such as sociological pluralism, freedom of conscience, social cooperation, compassion, and education, than whether they are religious or not. Our shared concerns are more important to me than the fact that we don't agree about the existence of any gods. This doesn't mean that we should de-emphasize concerns about truth, but while we pursue truth together, we can work for justice now. While it's unlikely that we'll see a world without religious belief anytime soon, there are important issues of human suffering that we can work to resolve right now. By working together, religious believers and non-believers, we can accomplish a lot more. At the same time, we can work for the destigmatization of different groups, which will eventually contribute to the decrease of ignorance. We can encourage a more civil and open dialogue about faith and reason, helping people come to terms with prejudices that might prevent them from considering other people's points of view. I would like to live in a more reasonable world where people aren't so defined and divided by the religious differences. Increasing access to education and promoting critical thinking is vitally important in this respect. Critiquing unreasonable and dehumanizing beliefs and actions is an important tactic too, but the spirit of that criticism makes a significant difference in how it is heard. People who engage in generalizations and stereotypes that dismiss all or a majority of religious believers or atheists as roadblocks to social progress increase the divisiveness of religious differences. Such sweeping claims are not only problematic, they also facilitate cultural divisions between various groups, and it's hard to see such irresponsible generalizations as doing more than contributing to ignorance by promoting untruth and fueling tribalistic divisions that inhibit intergroup communication and education. Unfortunately, some prominent atheists wish to build the walls that divide our communities even higher, and it's this tribalistic attitude that I critique in my work. For example, P.Z. Myers is perhaps the most read atheist blogger in the world and certainly one of the most outspoken. Last year, he and I participated in a public discussion on interfaith work at the Global Atheist Convention, which was the largest gathering of atheists in the world. In our discussion, Myers declared that the religious are a, quote, bunch of extreme, curse word. Is anyone uncomfortable with me saying a curse word? Can I say a curse word? You can bleep me out of the video if you want. He said that the religious are a bunch of extreme assholes, sorry about that, who have something profoundly wrong with their brains. That's a quote. In order to build up the atheist movement, he said, we need to employ us versus them tactics against the religious. When he was asked by an audience member when these in-group versus out-group walls would come down, he replied, "The walls will come down when religion is eradicated." I've been asked why I felt the need in my work to not only put forward ideas about interfaith cooperation, but to also critique some ideas and actions promoted by other atheists. And my response, I think, is simple. Some of the most visible atheist activism today is characterized by positions like P.Z. Myers, and I believe it is counterproductive. In my eyes, it largely fails to advance the acceptance of atheism. It certainly makes the work of building religious and non-religious coalitions much harder. It is symptomatic of tribalism and totalitarianism, which are qualities responsible for some of the worst in religious communities. Worse still, it confirms the suspicions of atheism's most ardent detractors, making it more difficult for outsiders to see atheists as a legitimate community. Some of my goals may be the same as those of other atheist activists, such as reducing the harmful influence of religious extremism and the unthinking totalitarian mindsets that exist in some communities. But I disagree with their methods. We need religious allies in order to further these goals, people in religious communities who share in these goals, and I do not see them being won over by the attitudes of many prominent atheists today. So, in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, how do we find those allies? How do we build those relationships? How can we achieve freedom of conscience while embracing our differences and being respectful in the face of these vast and polarizing disagreements? As an example, I think we can look at the group gathered here today. As members of different religious and non-religious communities in the United States, we recognize just by being here today that true freedom can only exist when it is rooted in mutual respect. Thus, freedom of conscience requires civility and cooperation. We may never agree on some matters, and that is just fine. We may never agree on the existence of God or an afterlife, but we can agree that life in the here and now requires that we find a way to live and work together and to be in dialogue and relationship with one another. In a world where freedom of conscience and expression are rare, agreement should not be our primary concern. Recognizing another person's fundamental right to disagree while respecting his or her humanity and highest principles is central to our ability to productively exchange ideas about what our disagreements are. This kind of civility builds trust. By engaging in respectful discourse, we ensure two things. First, that even the most sensitive questions can be asked about other people's beliefs, as they should be, without censorship. Thus, we do not avoid important or difficult questions out of fear. And second, regardless of whether we agree on an issue or not, we emerge with significantly more appreciation for one another and significantly less ignorance and suspicion. And in the end, that knowledge is of priceless benefit. We must actively dispel our fear of the unfamiliar and embrace our fellow human beings as equals, especially the ones with whom we might vehemently disagree. We need neither whitewash our differences nor force our views upon others. And under no circumstances can we compromise an individual's right to believe or not believe as she or he deems appropriate. In her novel Wise Blood, Flannery O'Connor, a Catholic woman living in Georgia who, if you read her letters, was in many ways a kind of evangelical, once wrote in Wise Blood, "There are all kinds of truth, but behind all of them there is only one truth, and that is that there is no truth." I don't know that I believe that, but I know that we will not come to a place of consensus on religious and metaphysical truth with a capital T claims in my lifetime. A much more achievable goal, I think, for atheists and religious believers alike, is working for a more civil, more compassionate, more relational, more honest, and forthright dialogue about our differences. That, in a world that privileges disagreement and conflict, also strives to identify our shared humanity and our common goals. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. I don't know about saving the best for last, but we'll give it our best shot here. I want to echo the sentiments of the other presenters who've come before us, and thanking the conference organizers and for all the hard work and everything that was done to bring us here and to bring such a diverse group of presenters at least together. I don't know about the audience, but we'll work on you. So happy to be here. This is not my first engagement with an atheist, as I recently wrote a review for the atheist channel of Patheos of Faithiest, and I noted in that review that previously, I'm originally from Northern California, on 3 occasions I had the opportunity to debate Dan Barker, who is a former Pentecostal minister turned atheist evangelist, and he sometimes jokes that he was a Pentecostal evangelist in the past and now he's an atheist evangelist. And I think there may be more truth to that than he might even realize himself. But we debated 3 times in Northern California, once on a kind of a neutral venue, once in a Christian venue, once in an atheist venue. And it was on the existence of God once and the resurrection of Christ twice. And I came away from those debates with the idea that I really don't want to do debates again. Not because I don't think they have their place and there isn't a place for persuasion and trying to argue for your position. But in my view, what we do many times, at least between the atheist and the humanist and the evangelical community, is debates are usually more of a forum where we use sales scripts to pitch our message to our constituents in the audience so that they feel good about their worldview. And we use each other as props in the process. And there's really no sense of dialogue and engagement, mutual vulnerability and self-criticism and all those kinds of things. So I am looking forward to our engagement today because it's not a debate, but a chance for he and I to engage each other. When we were approached about putting together these initial presentations, we were told that this part of it was for us to articulate our core beliefs and convictions that really provide a foundation for how we see our tradition should be engaging people in other religious or irreligious traditions. So I will be giving you some comments, some thoughts to you, but my primary audience is not so much to Chris. He and I will dialogue here in a little bit. And it's not really to you. I really want to speak, since this is being recorded, to my fellow evangelicals. We tend to either ignore the religious other, or more often than not, we tend to engage in confrontation and hostile kinds of defensive stances in regards to people of other religions. And atheism is on the list, but Mormonism is high on our list of religious others that we tend to be combative with. And I want to suggest a way forward beyond that with my opening remarks. And the reason is this: evangelicals, in my view, have a serious credibility problem in the public square. as well as inside of their own faith tradition. George Barna has discussed this problem from within. He discussed what he called 6 reasons why young Christians are leaving the church. And the first reason he cited is that churches seem overprotective, and in this regard, evangelical young people feel that, quote, much of their experience of Christianity feels stifling, fear-based, and risk-averse, close quote. The church fares a little better outside of the church than it does within it. In their book, Unchristian, What a New Generation Really Thinks About Christianity and Why It Matters, David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons document the views of teens to early 30-somethings who believe that Christians are sheltered and judgmental, among many other unflattering kinds of things. Now, these perceptions can also be found not only in regards to the specific things they identify. Homosexuality was one of the issues these young people identified as to why they found Christianity so distasteful, but I believe the way in which we engage people in other religious and irreligious traditions can be added to that list. Consider a few examples as to why Christianity may be suffering this credibility problem. Not long ago, former Republican presidential candidate Michelle Bachmann faced increasing criticism from both political parties due to accusations that then Hillary Clinton aide, Huma Abedin, belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem is that Abedin passed intense security scrutiny to obtain her job, and Bachmann's claim was also stymied by a lack of real evidence to substantiate what many labeled as an outlandish claim symptomatic of Islamophobia. But Bachmann is not alone as an evangelical in making questionable claims about Islam. Lieutenant General William G. Jerry Boykin, retired, is the new vice president of the Family Research Council. In his understanding of Islam, quote, we need to realize that Islam itself is not just a religion, it is a totalitarian way of life. It's a legal system, Sharia law. It's a financial system. It's a moral code. It's a political system. It's a military system. It should not be protected under the First Amendment, particularly given that those following the dictates of the Quran are under an obligation to destroy our Constitution and replace it with Sharia law, close quote. These conspiratorial and simplistic views of Islam held by Bachmann and Boykin are symptoms of something bigger. Evangelicals not only have a credibility problem when it comes to engaging Islam in American politics, but they are also ill-prepared for America's increasing religious pluralism in the public square. Stephen Prothero, in his book Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't, documents that most Americans, including Christians, lack the most basic understanding of various religions. This was confirmed in the Pew Forum's U.S. Religious Knowledge Survey in 2010, where atheists, agnostics, Jews, and Mormons outperformed Protestant evangelicals, mainline Protestants, and Catholics on questions about the core teachings, history, and leading figures of major world religions. Yet this uninformed stance toward other religions has not stopped Christians from forming judgments and taking actions on religious issues. After Mitt Romney announced his candidacy for president, many Christians said they would not vote for a quote-unquote cult member. Surprisingly, studies indicate that many eventually did. When a Lutheran minister, who was referenced in our first session this morning, participated in an interfaith memorial service in Yankee Stadium just days after 9/11, he received emails and letters from those in his own denomination accusing him of heresy and terrorism against Christianity. As a result of his work with the Muslim community, Pastor Rick Warren has been labeled a heretic and promoter of Chrislam, a heretical hybrid of Christianity and Islam. And in response to a Hindu offering the opening prayer for Congress, Christians shouted down the religious leader. If Christians are to overcome the credibility problem, they will have to address the reality of life and faith in the midst of religious diversity. Evangelicals also face challenges in engaging those opposed to religious belief, atheists and the secular humanists. We have a long history of clashes with atheists, agnostics, and skeptics, and much of contemporary evangelical apologetic responses are still geared towards atheistic secularism, even with the continued, if shifting, forms of religiosity in the public square. Perhaps you've seen some of this yourself, these types of interactions. An evangelical poses a provocative internet meme, a photo with a single sentence that is supposed to easily and quickly dismiss the validity of atheism as a legitimate and rational worldview. in one fell Facebook swoop. Atheists are quick to do the same, and when this is combined with the shrill rhetoric of the new atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, then we end up shouting past one another rather than finding ways in which to more positively engage each other, not only in our attempts at persuasion, but also for understanding and working together for our communities and for the broader culture. How can this credibility gap for evangelicals be addressed? How can we move forward in ways that are faithful to our religious convictions? And can this be done in positive ways without compromise? Chris has to find secular arguments to persuade the secular humanists why they should be engaging in interfaith dialogue, and I have to tap into the best of my religious tradition to provide biblical and theological arguments as to why evangelicals can and should do better. And I want to suggest there are a number of different ways in which this can be done, but with the limited time at my disposal, I want to talk about what I view as the top 3 reasons why, within our evangelical faith traditions, we ought to be taking a better way and have a different foundation for interfaith and even irreligious engagement. First, we need a more loving orthopathy. We need a more loving orthopathy. Now, you were out there scratching your heads, what in the world is orthopathy? You've probably heard of orthodoxy, right? We talked about it in the first session. Orthodoxy is the idea in religious traditions that there is a core body of beliefs or doctrines that are at the core. You're supposed to believe that, and if you don't, then you're heretical or you're outside of the bounds. You're heterodox. There's an orthodoxy. Now, evangelicalism has a strong sense of orthodoxy, and if you're not careful, you become suspect if the feeling is that you're somehow venturing into the unorthodox or heterodox kind of territory. So there's orthodoxy, there's also orthopraxis, which is the practices you do. We have a series of practices in evangelical Christianity, things that we do in church, an ethical system that we try to live. You've probably heard those kinds of concepts before, but one that you don't often hear is orthopathy. Orthopathy comes from the Greek word pathos. Used in a theological context, it refers to the right forms of passions, emotions, and empathies. This is the emotional and attitudinal dimension of our faith. It is my contention that in our concern as evangelicals for orthodoxy and orthopraxy, we have neglected, even violated, a balanced biblical form of orthopathy, an element just as vital to the right standards of faith as the other elements we tend to emphasize as evangelicals. For evangelicals, bringing one's life into conformity with the authority of the Bible is a primary concern. If we pause for a moment and reflect on biblical teaching, we discover that there is a lot there that we can bring to bear on this particular situation. The Bible not only touches on issues of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, but also on orthopathy, that emotional and attitudinal concept that one brings to engaging the religious other. Now, you heard some of that mentioned in our first session when we had mentioned by Joanna of this idea in the Old Testament of concern for the stranger in your midst, for the alien and the stranger. That's, again, 36 times in the Old Testament. Am I correct, Rabbi? He's shaking his head. I'm on firm territory there. So my evangelical sources were at least accurate in that regard. So we have this Old Testament concept of love for alien and stranger. If you move over to the New Testament, this is picked up as a strand in the ethical teaching of Jesus, with this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. And the question is asked by the Jewish legal scholar, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells a story about the Samaritan. So in other words, even the person I don't like in the religious tradition I abhor is actually my neighbor. In fact, that person, if you look at the story carefully, may be living some kind of form of genuine spirituality better than the Orthodox. It's a very subversive kind of story. So there's this idea of orthopathy, love for the alien and the stranger. As Amos Young says in his book, Hospitality and the Other, we need to explore the implications of that important parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus talks about for interreligious encounters. And Amos Young says this: in spite of the fact that Samaritans had just rejected Jesus' visitation, it's found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 9, Jesus nevertheless presents the Samaritan as fulfilling the law, loving his neighbor, and embodying divine hospitality. If the Samaritans were those of the other religion to the Jew of the first century, what implications does this parable hold regarding those in other faiths for Christians in the 21st century? In other words, there is a wealth of material in the Old and New Testaments that evangelicals can look to as a foundation for the sense of orthopathy, loving your neighbor as yourself, bringing a new attitude and an emotion to your experience with people in other religious traditions. One of my friends and colleagues who's been involved in a number of years with interreligious dialogue is Terry Muck, formerly a professor at Asbury Theological Seminary. He's been involved in Buddhist-Christian dialogue for many years. Wrote an essay, one of many, on interreligious dialogue, and in one of his essays it struck me, he described interreligious dialogue in this way, quote, "Interreligious dialogue is an expression of a fundamental emotion or attitude toward people who believe differently on the most important aspects of life." Close quote. So in our keynote, we heard that we ought to think about interfaith as a discipline. I want to supplement that and said interfaith ought to be, or not interfaith, whatever. We want to call it with something that's outside of that traditional box. It should be not just a discipline, but instead it's an emotion or attitude. It's a way of life in which we engage other people. So this idea of a revised orthopathy on the part of evangelicals is tremendously important. We have an orthopathy, but it tends to be one of defensiveness and anger and hostility towards religious and irreligious others. We need instead a more loving orthopathy. Second, evangelicals must adopt a Christological hermeneutic of Scripture. Okay? In other words, we need to look at Scripture through the lens of the experience of the early church and our continuing experience with Christ. What are the implications of this? They're tremendous. And an example of this comes for the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul's use of the Old Testament in Romans 15, verses 8 to 18, provides one of the best examples of how the experience of the risen Christ in his life dramatically changed the way in which he and other apostolic authors understood what we would call the Old Testament and interacted with its text while writing the New Testament. In Romans 15, Paul quotes Psalm 18:41-49 and Deuteronomy 32:43. As he does so, he edits and shapes the material. Derek Flood, in his essay in Sojourners, now being expanded into a book-length treatment, describes Paul's hermeneutical process and says that he, quote, has removed the references in the Old Testament to violence against Gentiles and recontextualize these passages to instead declare God's mercy in Christ for Gentiles, close quote. This is part of a hermeneutical pattern for Paul, and Flood points out that, quote, this is not a case of careless out-of-context proof texting. It is an artful and deliberate reshaping of these verses. From their original cry for divine violence into a confession of universal culpability that highlights our need for mercy, close quote. Flood understands this hermeneutic is taking place as a result of Paul's conversion out of his own life of religious violence in persecuting Christians on behalf of Judaism to the way of Jesus and the way of grace. And he concludes by suggesting that, quote, Paul's conversion from religious violence to the way of grace in Christ became the interpretive lens through which he subsequently read all of Scripture. If we wish as Christians to adopt Paul's way of interpreting Scripture, then we need to learn to read our Bibles with that same grace-shaped focus, close quote. Evangelicals tend to gravitate towards a select number of Bible verses that serve as the foundation for engaging people in other religious traditions, such as Jesus' harsh rebuke of the Jewish religious leaders, calling them whitewashed tombs in one particular instance in the Gospel of Matthew. You'll find many evangelicals gravitating towards these kinds of passages, or the story in Elijah with the prophets of Baal, and they say this is how we're supposed to engage people in other religious traditions, harshly, confrontationally, with a great zeal for truth and a passion for the gospel. But my suggestion is, instead, that those are the wrong texts and the wrong context, and we need instead to adopt a Christological hermeneutic, and that provides us an alternative set of biblical passages that provide a foundation for us in interreligious engagement. Harold Netland of Trinity International University has stated that, quote, in the years ahead it will be important for evangelicals, missionaries, and local Christian leaders alike to formulate a biblically faithful and culturally appropriate theology of religions, close quote. And I suggest that we need to formulate such a theology, but it needs to be taken in a very different direction. This brings me to my third and final point, and that is that evangelicals must reconsider the example of Jesus in interreligious encounters. We must consider or reconsider the example of Jesus in interreligious encounters. A new movement has arisen within evangelicalism among organizations like the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy and others. A movement of people who believe that it is possible to engage those in other religions or irreligious traditions without compromise, and yet to do so in civility. At the core of this movement is the desire to follow the way of Jesus. As Bob Robinson has helpfully pointed out in his book, Jesus and the Religions, to understand the example of Jesus for a religiously diverse world, we must consider those biblical passages where Jesus interacts with Gentiles and Samaritans. After considering what might be learned from these interactions, we can then emulate this approach and apply it to Christian engagement with those in other religions. Let me conclude. I suggest that these three elements should be understood as the core beliefs and convictions of evangelical Christians for engaging the other, whether the religious or irreligious other in the public square. A loving orthopathy or emotion and attitude in regards to others, a Christological hermeneutic in the way of peace and grace in relation to others, and the example of Jesus in his encounters with Gentiles and Samaritans. A growing number of evangelicals are putting them into practice, and we have found great receptivity among those who might have formerly considered us enemies. If evangelicals can engage in a process of critical self-reflection about how we engage others in the public square, we will not only overcome our credibility problem, I believe, but we might be surprised to find that we can gain a new hearing, at least an interest, in the message of Jesus that we hold so dear. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Chris. And we'll be taking a few-minute break. We want to start again at 2 o'clock, so don't wander too far. And Brian Birch will be moderating. We'll have a continued discussion on this topic. Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind taking your seats, we'll go ahead and get started with our next session. My name is Brian Birch, and I teach in the Religious Studies Department here at Utah Valley University, and have the pleasure of working with colleagues and friends on interreligious engagement activities here. And I think that the organizers of this conference deserve our thanks, especially Blair Van Dyke and Kufre Ekpenyong and Daniel Culver. So please join me in thanking them. This has been a remarkable day so far, and it really shows what can happen when you have articulate, eloquent, passionate people who really want to understand and persuade others toward, peace and understanding. And I think that we've received a rich amount of that today. Both John and Chris have been introduced to you, but just quickly. John Moorhead is the custodian of the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, and he is also the director of the Western Institute for Intercultural Studies. And I have had the pleasure of working with John over the past few years on various projects, and he's doing remarkable work, and appreciate him coming here today. I just met Chris earlier at lunch. His book, Faithiest, has been a phenomenon and really is breaking new ground in the ways in which different ideologies and perspectives can come together through common values and commitments to justice. And so I applaud his work and wish him well in the future. The session, as it's going to proceed now, is going to be Chris and John engaging one another with questions and interaction for about the first 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please be thinking of a question that either comes out of the dialogue now or which came out of their remarks earlier. So with that said, I'll leave it to you two and step back in about 25 or 30 minutes.
Hello, John.
Is this where we're supposed to
I was going to say, maybe I'm going to turn my chair a little bit.
Hold it closer. You want me to hold it? All right, can you?
Yeah. All right, well, this is fine. We'll just leave
There
this
we
one
go.
on. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Well, hello, Chris. I will jump in
Please.
and offer something to kind of get us going here. First of all, let me thank you for coming out, and I know you got a very busy schedule as your book and your infamy continues to grow over the book that you've got there. But also let me compliment that by offering an apology on behalf of, to the extent that I can, on behalf of my religious community. If you haven't read Chris's book, Fatheist, you need to, as you learn of his experience, which has unfortunately been echoed many times by many people in the homosexual community who have struggled with their own identity just in and of itself in a largely non-queer population. But then when you add the religious mix to it and very conservative religious traditions, which evangelicalism is, and also Mormonism, and if we're honest about it, we have contributed to that angst and the struggles and the difficulties. And to the extent that I can speak for my religious community, I offer apologies for your experience and those people who are gay and queer and lesbian who have gone through these and continue to go through these kinds of experiences. I will say in a slight bit of transparency that homosexuality has impacted my family dynamics, and it has been difficult as an evangelical public figure to some extent. I tend to keep those kinds of things close to the vest simply because of my concern for losing credibility within my own religious community because of those particular issues. So it's not just something that gay people face, it's people in the religious communities who love them who have to navigate their way through those issues as well. So I offer my apologies for your experiences and my suggestion and hope that the kinds of principles that we're putting forward here for interreligious engagement also apply not only for interreligious but non-religious, but also in the homosexuality debate. Regardless of what we think are sacred narratives and scriptures tell us about the issue of sexual identity, regardless of that, there's got to be a better way that we can relate to each other over this issue. We're demonizing each other, we're talking past each other, we're having rallies, and we're buying Chick-fil-A sandwiches in opposition to each other. And along the way, we're missing the human element and really working together to resolve a difficult situation in the public square. So I offer that to you.
Well, thank you very much. You certainly, I do not expect you to apologize on behalf of your entire community, but thank you anyway. You know, I think that you're absolutely right that oftentimes this sort of human component is missing from these conversations around morality and sexuality, and to the real detriment of making advancement in that respect. I mean, I think that this is something that unfortunately happens on both sides. And you know, this is something I hear about a lot in atheist circles. A lot of people in the atheist community will look to the LGBT community and the incredible progress that has been made around societal acceptance for queer people in the last few decades. And they'll say, you know, much like the LGBT movement, in the atheist movement, we need, as many people sort of term it, firebrands and diplomats. We need people who are, you know, sort of out there making nice, building relationships, being friendly, putting a happy face on queer people, and then we need the people who are sort of more aggressively fighting for queer rights. And they'll say, you know, as atheists, we should sort of model our approach as a community off of that. We need to have the sort of diplomatic outreach, and then we need to have the more aggressive, confrontational approach. And one of the ways in which I think that this parallel, as a queer person who is a part of the queer community, one of the ways in which I think this parallel is really sort of lacking is that in the queer community, the firebrands that, you know, historically have existed in the LGBT movement and still exist today, very few, if any, were sort of, or named as one of their goals, the elimination of heterosexuality, right? I mean, that would be a bit silly. What they were fighting against was heteronormativity, the idea that heterosexuality is the sort of only allowed, let alone accepted, possible expression of sexual orientation identity. And there were some who were more aggressive about it, and there were some who were more diplomatic, but ultimately they were working toward the same goal. And in the atheist movement, I think that there are sort of competing and contradictory goals. There are some people who are looking for the acceptance of atheists and a more sort of open conversation about religion. And then there are also people who are looking for the elimination of religion. And those are the people who are often termed as firebrands. And I think that the parallel is lacking because of that disconnect. I'm personally not interested in working for a religion-free world. I don't necessarily think that it's even a possibility, but it's certainly not something that I'm trying to achieve. And so I actually, if I can borrow from a term that I believe was coined by one of our participants here today, Josh Stanton, I've been borrowing this term quite a bit lately. As an atheist, I'm interested in challenging theonormativity, much like queer people or queer activists are often interested in challenging heteronormativity. So I'm interested in challenging the idea that religiosity is sort of assumed, and that belief in God is the only sort of normative allowed way of being in the world. And so I think that in that respect, there is much to be learned from the way that the queer movement has really advanced a more civil, compassionate conversation around sexuality in terms of looking at how atheists and religious believers communicate with one another. And one last thought I want to share. I don't want to monopolize the microphone, so please cut me off after this. But particularly, one other thing that comes to mind in response to what you've offered here is, oftentimes I'm asked by other atheists or other queer people how it is that I can engage in interfaith work with sometimes with people who fundamentally believe that who I am is sort of immoral or wrong as a queer person, or I suppose as an atheist as well. And it really does present a significant challenge. But one example that I often look to is a couple of years ago, I was giving one of my first speeches. I was really new at this and was much shyer than I am today, although I'm still a little shy. And the speech, I got the speech over with. It went fine. I was happy about that, and really felt like it had been a positive experience. And afterwards, after almost everyone had cleared out, a young woman came up to me, and she said right away that I had a demon inside of me that was making me gay. Like, those were the very first words out of her mouth. And she explained that she knew this because she had a demon inside of her that was making her gluten intolerant, and she had prayed to cast the demon out and was no longer gluten intolerant. And if I had prayed to cast the demon out, I would no longer be intolerant of women or something, I suppose. And I think to be fair, she didn't realize that this was a real sort of trigger for me, that this was the exact message that I had internalized when I was younger that had done so much psychological damage to me during my developmental years. And yet it was, and my sort of impulse was to respond in one of a few ways, to either get really upset, to get angry and to sort of shout at her, or at least to as calmly as possible and rationally as possible explain to her just how sort of damaging this message is to people like me, and the real sort of harm it does. I was sort of debating how I was going to respond, and because I took a moment to sort of stop and think about what I was going to do, my sort of initial emotional reaction calmed down a little bit, and I had a moment to pause and reflect a bit, and in doing so, I noticed that she was nervous. I realized that she was kind of looking down. She had been shaking a little bit. She had kind of struggled to get her words out, and so I would love to say that I'm always this self-aware and always this gracious. I'm not, but in this moment I happened to sort of live up to my highest principles, and I said to her, I just want to say thank you for being honest with me, for your bravery, for coming up to me and saying something that you feel is very important, but that might have been difficult to share because you might think that that's something I don't want to hear. And so I just kind of expressed my gratitude for that honesty and that bravery. And I think she wasn't expecting that. I mean, I think she was expecting a confrontation. She was expecting me to shout at her or something. She was expecting to have her sort of beliefs confirmed by our interaction. And I think that by extending compassion and patience to her, it was a really sort of surprising moment. And we were then able to enter into a very honest, constructive, and civil conversation about our disagreements in this respect. And, I mean, personally, I would love to be able to say that she left that interaction and, like, went straight back to her dorm room and made a gay rights sign and stood on the street corner and in rainbow flags or whatever. That didn't happen, I'm pretty sure. I guess I didn't follow her back to her dorm, so I don't know. But I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. But I can say that because we were able to have that kind of a conversation instead of the usual kind of confrontational, disagreement and argument that occurs at the intersection of more evangelical beliefs and conversations about sexuality, she now has another point of reference when she's thinking about homosexuality. She has a person that she's met, a body that she's hugged, a set of stories and experiences that she can relate to, a person who has experienced many of the same challenges in life and who has asked many of the same questions, and that is the ground in which a seed of transformation can grow. And I don't necessarily mean that she's going to do a 180 and change her theological views on sexuality, but she may come to a place where she's able to say, I don't agree with that, but I also think that that person should be free to do what they will. And I think that a more compassionate and constructive conversation around sexuality and theology is greatly needed at this point, particularly when it comes to the relationship between the LGBT community and more conservative religious communities, which often demonize one another in equal measure.
In case, I think Chris had some doubts we could have an extended dialogue, and I think you can see that that's not going to be a problem, that he can...
Well, I have doubts about everything, so...
That's true. Maybe we can make you a believer after our dialogue. Anyway.
You wouldn't be the first to try.
It's interesting to me, I've noticed a similar dynamic with evangelicalism and Mormonism, that atheism or humanism, whatever we want to call it, and evangelicalism share a lot of commonalities. And I wonder if sometimes it's discomfort with those commonalities which adds to our friction. Evangelicals are different than Mormons in that we love truth with a capital T, right? For you, it's more experiential. For us, it's more propositional. And it's more, we want to offer theological and philosophical arguments to substantiate what we believe. Now, of course, the atheists are going to jump in and say, you're offering lousy arguments, you're not doing enough rationality and truth, but that's another element. We emphasize truth. We are very aware about our boundaries. We're always defending and defining our boundaries, and to a certain extent, at least in evangelicalism, we're doing boundary maintenance. We're worried about who's in and who's out. And we want to make sure that if you're not thinking correctly or acting correctly, you're on the out, you're on the other side. We tend to be very contentious about how we go about defining ourselves and engaging others. Do you think that those kinds of parallels are also going on in humanism, and it plays into the dynamics of our contentious interaction?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I feel like that this is something that I was touching on a little bit in my remarks earlier. I think that, in many ways there are striking parallels between evangelical Christian communities and many atheist communities, and I can say this sort of based on personal experience, having situated myself in both at one point or another in my life. And, I see this sort of play out in many of the intra-community conversations that are occurring within organized atheism right now. In particular, conversations around how to relate with those who are outside of the community. And I remember as an evangelical feeling very suspicious of people outside of my own community, and some of that was, sort of self-created and came from a place of just being young and being very black and white about my own boundaries. But some of it was, I think, definitely encouraged by the sort of ethos of the community. And I see some similar behavior going on among atheists, and I think that I would be interested to hear more of your thoughts on what you think the relationship is between sort of rigid tribal boundaries that say, I would completely trust or somewhat trust, people who are within this circle, who self-define in this way, who share certain core convictions. But I am, and probably most people wouldn't actually phrase it in this way, but I'm not willing to be nearly as charitable or at all charitable toward people who are outside of the boundaries that I have established along with the others in my community. And I think that this presents a real problem for people who are in communities that are a little bit more closed, who want to do some of that kind of outreach, because simply by expressing even an interest in doing that kind of outreach, you've thus sort of cast yourself outside of your own community. Being included within that tribal boundary is sort of contingent on adopting the norms within that community in terms of how people relate to those outside of it. And I can say, just based on my experiences in the atheist movement, simply saying, hey, I think it would be good and constructive if we were able to find other ways to talk to religious believers means that, some atheists who are in relatively prominent positions within the community question whether I'm even an atheist at all. That even saying that means that I very well might not be an atheist. And I would be interested to hear you reflect on what parallels you see within the evangelical community in that respect.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, being involved as an evangelical in a largely conservative religious tradition and being involved in what they see as interfaith, which I would define more along the lines of religious diplomacy, I would make a distinction. Because we're not denying differences and disagreements. We're saying, let's engage each other as trustworthy rivals and contestants and realize we may never be able to resolve those issues, but we can still work together for the common good. And even defining things like that, evangelicals are very suspicious not only of the process of dialogue, but also of those who encourage that you should be involved in it. The accusation is compromise, liberal, postmodern, don't believe in truth with a capital T, all those things. And in fact, it was interesting. I'll tell a little story here. I had the opportunity to write a review for the Englewood Review of Books of Brian McLaren's fine new book that came out last year that doesn't so much touch on interfaith dialogue, it touches on what he calls conflicted religious identity syndrome. This idea that Christians have a hostile posture in their faith identity in terms of how they relate to people in other religions. And his book, I didn't agree with all of it, and I wrote what I thought was a fair and balanced review that brought out the positives, left a couple of points at the end where I think I disagree and would like to dialogue with him over these issues. And it went out, and it turned out to be one of the top 10 or 20 book reviews for last year, in great measure because of Brian's book. And what happened was I received an email from a pastor friend of mine who said, we need to go to lunch. And I hadn't heard from this guy in years.
I know what that means.
I used to work for him on staff, and I left because I was going one way and he was going another, and we just didn't see eye to eye. And rather than try to bring him to my correct way of thinking, I thought, you go your way and I'll go mine. So now I'm hearing from him. So I knew what was happening, but I thought, all right, we'll go. And we had lunch. And so it was myself and this pastor and another pastoral type there as kind of a moderator. He was a neutral moderator, but he had some concerns too. And the concern was, because I wrote a positive review of Brian McLaren's book, I must be a supporter of Brian McLaren on everything he's ever said, on every issue, and I might be liberal, and they were concerned that I might be heretical. In other words, you're pushing the boundaries of the tribe of evangelicalism. So for whatever reason, the problem isn't the tribes. The problem isn't our being a part of tribes. The problem is when tribes move into tribalism. We all tend to gravitate towards specific social groups. Many of us inhabit numerous social groups all the time. That's not the problem. The problem is when our groups go to war with other tribes and it becomes tribalism. And you've experienced it within atheism because of your interfaith work. I've experienced it within evangelicalism. The strange thing for us is that we supposedly have a religious tradition based upon, at least in part, the ethical teachings of someone who, in his ministry, who went constantly to the margins of his society and embraced the outcast. And instead, we have become like the Pharisees that are portrayed in the New Testament Gospels. So it's a strange and curious state of affairs, which is why, in part in my opening presentation, I tried to call evangelicals to a different and I think better way, rooted within another aspect of our tradition that provides a better foundation for engagement that avoids that tribalism.
So one thing that you said early on in that last comment is something I'd like to invite some additional reflection on, which is this idea of compromise. Now, this is like a really dirty word in certain communities. I think it's certainly seen as a dirty word among atheists, depending on sort of the ways in which you use it, I suppose. But, you know, this has always been a sort of point of confusion for me, because I think, first of all, as a pragmatist, compromise is sort of necessary in order to accomplish anything in a world in which, you know, an infinite number of different views coexist alongside one another. And yet, I also think that compromise can actually be, there can actually be sort of an ethical imperative to compromise, to allowing your point of view to intermingle and cohabitate with another person's, to find the best in your point of view and marry it with the best in somebody else's, to recognize that it is sort of inherently selfish to adopt a my way or the highway approach, to be sort of unflinchingly unwilling to compromise. And yet, there is this idea that you can only compromise to a certain degree, and I've always had a difficult time understanding where that line is, when I've crossed over into compromising too far, when, you know, being willing to meet people more than halfway sometimes is seen as something that sort of runs really contrary to some of the core values of the organized atheist, humanist, skeptic community. And in fact, you know, a great example of this is the fact that, you know, so the title of my book, Faithiest, was actually, it's not, I wish I could say that I invented the term, but I didn't. It was actually used and is sometimes used against atheists who are seen as, I guess, too willing to compromise, too friendly towards the religious. It was the very first time I went to an atheist meeting, which I write about this in the book. The very first time I went to an atheist meeting and I described some of the work that I was doing, I was called a faithiest, and I quite liked it because I like wordplay, so I decided it was ripe for reclaiming. But faithiest isn't the only word. The other term that's used pretty often to describe this kind of atheist is an accommodationist. They'll say, oh, you're an accommodationist. And you know, I was talking with my mother about the work that I do, because she's sort of watched over the last number of years with a sort of curiosity and fascination how this conversation has evolved, as someone who's kind of sits outside of a lot of these discussions. And I like talking with her because she helps me sort of see outside of the bubble of what I'm doing. And she kind of laughed the first time that she was talking to me about this word accommodationist, because she said, you know, isn't that, to me, that sounds like a good thing. Like, if I invite people over to visit, I want to be accommodating. Like, I'm not going to say, here's how we do it at my house, and you can do it the way that I do it, or you can leave. I'm going to say, what do you need to be comfortable? What do I need to do in order to create a space where you feel like you can, you know, exist in my environment and feel comfortable enough to be able to sort of be in conversation and relationship with me? And she says, why is this term being used in such a derogatory way? You know, I was always raised to believe that being accommodating is a good thing. And, you know, I think it's a conversation worth having, because I don't think that you should compromise on everything. There's certainly many things that I'm not willing to compromise on. But I think that this idea that compromise is something that's sort of inherently bad in the eyes of some people is really troubling, and it's something that makes it really hard to talk to people in other communities with whom, you know, you're going to have to compromise in certain ways in order to even be able to get the conversation going. So what do you think?
Yeah, when I use the term compromise, that is a term that is associated with FRD. It's included in our little evangelical chapter slogan about engaging others without compromise in civility, and I don't think we're as far apart as you might. Sure. FRD, and I don't think we're far apart. Yeah, compromise has to be made, but when I say without compromise, it means at some point individuals and religious traditions have some kind of line in the sand with core convictions that they're not willing to compromise. So, for example, if you and I were to engage in extended dialogue over a period of time, and you would be desirous that I would compromise by saying I can retain my Christian identity, but this idea of I have to jettison the belief in God to do so. I can't compromise to that extent. I know there are liberal Christians who do that. That would be quite a request. I know that there are some Christians that do that. That for them, but I won't get into it. But at any rate, there are certain core convictions which can't be compromised, but that doesn't mean that compromise cannot be done and that compromise is always a bad thing.
Sure, but just real quick, and I understand we're going to move into a slightly different format in a moment, but do you see this as, not for yourself or the organizations that you work with, but do you see this as sort of in the larger conversation within the evangelical Christian community, do you see compromise as something that's viewed as a negative practice?
And that's why that term is included in the slogan, because the website is basically an online brochure for wary evangelicals to make the best case possible in a short period of time that this is an okay and good thing and you can be involved. Now, I can't take a slogan and say, without compromise and civility, and by compromise, I mean blah, 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 and go on for 5 minutes. So it's through bringing them in, getting them involved, educating them, that they understand what kinds of compromise are permissible and okay, and what kinds might need to be more carefully thought through, and so on. So it's the use of a term in shorthand that has more depth to it, and many times ambiguity that comes out in the dialogue process. So it was a good question.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. We have microphones there. Please raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come before you state your question. And just as a couple of reminders, please make your questions brief and allow the participants time to answer. So with that, we'll open it up.
Can I make a request?
Please.
If you're comfortable doing so, if you wouldn't mind sharing your name and one thing about you, it helps me get a sense that I'm hearing from a person rather than just a mouth asking a question. If you're comfortable, you don't have to.
Who's first?
Oh, sure. Well, Alain de Botton, which I never know if I'm saying his name correctly, so let's just hope that that's correct. He wrote a book that came out in I think it came out in what, my entire life's blurring together right now, forgive me. I think it came out in 2011, called Religion for Atheists. And it was a really fascinating book. Much like your assessment of Brian McLaren's book, I don't know that I agreed with everything, and I mean, frankly, if you ever read a book and agree with every single word in it, you should read it a second time, I think. But I also thought that it was, it was a really sort of wonderful look at the way in which secular society has, in many ways, failed to offer some of the things that religion has offered throughout human history. As an example of this, I feel bad. I talk about my mother all the time. I don't think that her friends search out these videos on the internet, so hopefully this is fine. But my mother is, I would describe her as philosophically agnostic. She goes to a Christian church, but she doesn't really believe in God. She really just goes because she enjoys the sort of structure of it. She enjoys the community. She likes singing the hymns, and she really likes the sermon. That's her favorite part, because it reminds her to do, to sort of be more self-aware, to be kinder and more generous, to, give back to others, to be more charitable. And, this is a point that Alain makes in his book, is that, religion, for its adherents, offers things like reminders to, to sort of be good and to be kind and to try to aspire to live out our greatest principles, because as human beings, we so often forget to do these things. We sort of retreat back within our self-interested point of view and forget about the things that we claimed to care so passionately about just the day before. And religion in many ways provides these kind of regular reminders. And he proposed in the book a sort of way in which a secular society might continue to perpetuate those kinds of practices from a secular point of view. And I thought it was a really useful and thought-provoking proposal. And as I've continued to sort of track his work following the publication of that book and a lot of what he's doing with the School of Life in the UK, he just recently put out a list of, I think it was 10 like suggestions rather than commandments or something, 10 sort of principles for atheists to try to keep in mind. That was, something he said that like this is sort of a working document that can evolve and so on and so forth. I think that there's a real worthwhile conversation to be had about the ways in which atheists and humanists talk about these things and the way in which they sort of actually live them out. As a chaplain, an atheist chaplain, and community organizer, this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on in the local community of atheists, agnostics, and humanists in Boston. We have a humanist community center in Harvard Square where we have open to the public events several days a week. We bring in speakers, we have interfaith dialogues, we do community service projects, and I think that this kind of humanist community can be an important resource for people who are looking for some of the sort of structural things that religious institutions have often provided, but from a secular point of view. And I think that there's a real need for these because there was a book that came out in 2010 called American Grace by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. It was this extensive study of the lives of religious Americans, and they found that religious Americans are much more civically engaged than the non-religious. They give more money to charity, both religious and secular. They're more likely to volunteer for charitable causes, and they're more likely to run for political office, and so on and so forth. They're just overall more active and engaged citizens. But they found that the correlation between religious identification and civic engagement actually wasn't connected to the sort of intensity of an individual's religious belief, how devout they were. It was connected to how involved they were with their religious community. And they found actually that a non-believing spouse of a religious person who participated in the life of their religious community with their spouse was as likely to be civically engaged as the believing spouse was. And they speculated that non-religious moral communities could serve a similar function in equipping and inspiring and engaging non-religious people in broader society. And so one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about organizing humanist community is because I think it provides a safe space for non-religious people in a highly religious society, but also because it creates a space for non-religious people to be in relationship with religious believers, and it makes it easier for religious believers to find where non-religious people are and have those kinds of constructive interfaith dialogues. And it can provide some of the structure that religion often provides for people, a lot of the benefits that come out of participating in a religious community. We're definitely, it's an experiment. We definitely have a really sort of imperfect community, and we're still figuring out what this looks like. But I think that, people like Alain de Botton are also providing really fascinating roadmaps for how this might be, how these kinds of structures might be built for secular people.
I'll just add a very brief PS to that, since I'm not familiar with the book, but want to be now, having heard Chris talk about it. It's always has struck me strange that if religion evolved with the human species over time, then it is an intrinsic part of what it means to be human. Are atheists perhaps reacting more to the abuse of religious functions by religious communities, and thereby missing some of their own, what they can borrow from it and create to it? If the essence of the word religion means to bind other individuals, to bind to communities, could, as this author is putting forth, could some of the better ideas of religion be adapted in a non-religious context for a non-religious community, so you can have the best of what it provides without the problematic elements that you see? So it would seem to me that there's a lot of promise to that.
My name is Mikhail. I'm not a student here. I'm just here out of pure interest. My question, it's the same question for both of you, but obviously it's different, seeing it's different faith and non-faith. It's what makes you, I guess, appealing? For Chris, what makes you appealing in the sense that for a religious person such as myself, in my eyes, you don't have a belief of an afterlife. You don't have a belief of a general purpose on life other than just to, from what you said, your purpose is just to make as great as an impression as possible. But from the general atheist perspective, what makes you appealing that gives you purpose in life? And then for you, John, what makes you appealing in the sense that because as a evangelical or Protestant, there are so many different Protestant faiths. It seems like I'm from the South, so I mean, there's a lot of different Protestant faiths, and they are all competing. There's two Baptist churches right next to each other, right down from where I live, and their congregation almost hates each other, and I don't get it. So, with that being said, as a general Protestant faith, what makes you appealing as well?
I'll go first. I think what makes me appealing is my charm and good looks, but
Oh, you took mine. Just kidding.
other than that, I don't really, I'm not comfortable with, I in my presentation, I offered a critique of my own religious community, and I think there's a lot more there that can be critiqued. There's a great deal that I disagree with in a variety of Protestant denominations and so on. And even outside of Protestantism. So I'm not here to say my version of evangelicalism is the most appealing thing and everybody ought to embrace it. But I will tell you this, even though I wrestle with, one of the things I loved, I read a book recently, Peter Enns was one of the contributors. He was an evangelical. It was an evangelical, a Roman Catholic scholar, and a Jewish scholar. And it was, the thrust of the book was, can you read the Bible both as an object of religious devotion and in terms of scholarship and higher criticism? Can you bring those two things together? And the convictions of all of them was yes, although they had different ways in which they went about it. And one of the things that I took away from that book was the Jewish way of reading the Bible, which is a very non-Protestant, non-evangelical way. And it goes back to some of what we heard in the first session, this idea of the name change to Israel, wrestling with God. When Jews experience their faith and in reading the Torah, they are wrestling with God. What does it mean to be a person in covenant with God? And I try to apply that to my own religious tradition. What does it mean for me to be a person who is grappling with all kinds of different things in our culture today? What does it mean to wrestle with God, wrestle with my religious text? And one thing I cannot shake, and that is, for me, the figure of Jesus of Nazareth is an amazing personality. This person in the first century who was willing, again, to go to the outcasts of his society, to the margins, who had this either crazy or amazingly true sense of self-identity, and whose followers came to see him as more than human, and he leads this incredible social movement. Now, it could be argued that perhaps Christians have missed some of the essence of what Jesus was about. I'm open to those kinds of conversations. But what I want to present, what I think is most appealing, is not the Baptists or the Lutherans or the Presbyterians or even Protestants or Catholics or Orthodox. For me, I'm intrigued and fascinated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and I think he has relevance for today. And that's what I want to talk about, and that's what I want amongst people of differing religious faiths and irreligious faiths, and what does his social and spiritual movement mean, if anything, for people in the 21st century. That's what I find appealing, and that's what I hope other people find appealing as well.
Well, I wouldn't describe myself at all as an evangelical atheist. I'm not really interested in trying to deconvert people out of their faith communities. I happen to know and love and work with many people who would call themselves evangelical atheists, and they're sort of better suited to make the sort of arguments for why, why they believe that that's an important thing to do. But, I will say personally that when I stopped believing in the Christian faith that I had sort of taken on when I was younger and began to enter into a period of sort of critical self-reflection and greater sort of personal inquiry, I actually found my atheism to be a real source of inspiration and sort of liberating belief, because when I stopped believing, and I want to be careful not to imply that I think that people who do believe these things don't also share in this same kind of sense. But for me personally, when I stopped believing, for example, that there was an afterlife, it really made me focus on living the best life that I could in the here and now. I felt like the fact that I exist at all when there's no sort of reason for me to exist, and there's no greater plan that has put me here, is really an amazing thing, and it's a sort of source of great awe and wonder. And because I know that, or because I believe that there's no sort of greater plan for my life, or nobody who's sort of orchestrating things, no force that's orchestrating things, it makes me, take on a real sense of responsibility and personal agency to live the best life that I can for myself and for other people as well. And because I feel like my life could end at any moment for any reason, it really makes me appreciate every single moment that I have. And I didn't really have that same sort of sense of appreciation when I was a believer. So for me personally, I derive a lot of inspiration from being an atheist, and I think that that's part of the appeal. But it's interesting to me because, like I said, I'm not an evangelical about being an atheist. I think it's perfectly fine if people are believers. What I am evangelical about is promoting certain ideals and values like sociological social pluralism, cooperation across tribal boundaries, critical thinking and education and compassion. These are things that I'm evangelical about. These are things that I try to persuade people to adopt. But I think that there's actually less of an imperative on an atheist to be evangelical about it than there is for someone who, for example, does believe in an afterlife, in particular an afterlife that you have to sort of meet certain standards in order to have access to. I talk with evangelical Christian friends from back when I was an evangelical who, really do feel a sort of sense of urgency around the fact that I don't believe anymore because they feel like they're not going to spend eternity with me. And the fact that they have that belief, to me, means that they actually have a moral imperative to try to be persuasive. I had a really long conversation with a friend of mine who I've known for so long, since I was an evangelical Christian, whose wedding I was invited to do a reading from, and they asked me to do the only non-biblical reading in the wedding. And we had this long conversation about it, and I said that it doesn't bother me at all that she's a Christian, and but she was very honest with me about the fact that she really worries about my salvation. And some people might see that as kind of insulting or something, or maybe think that she thinks that she's better than me or something like that. But I don't see it that way at all. I think that she just has a certain commitment that for her it's very important, given her worldview, to let me know exactly what she thinks about that. And for me, I guess, as an atheist who believes that when we die, there's nothing else, that it doesn't really matter to me if someone dies believing in God or not, because it's not going to change necessarily anything. So I went a little bit off track there, but I wonder, real quick before we take another question, if you have thoughts on that as an evangelical.
Well, one thing I appreciate about what you said was, I think many times an evangelical once said that Christians are so heavenly minded they're of no earthly good. That is, they're so fixated on the salvation issue and missions and evangelism and all this that many times there's this battle within evangelicalism, I don't know if it's in Mormonism, of the priority or relationship between evangelism and social action. Should I spend more of my time sharing the content of the message, or should I take care of the poor and the needy and the suffering and all that? And some evangelicals started to say, they're not in competition with each other. We should be doing all of it. And if we so emphasize the possibility of an afterlife that we neglect taking care of human need here and now and working for justice and the things that Jesus himself talked about as a part of the kingdom that he saw himself inaugurating, then to me that's non-Christian. So I think there's a place for self-critique amongst evangelicals in hearing the voice of the atheist who is more focused on a life that they only see now and not in the beyond, that can provide a helpful corrective for evangelicals and other Christians on bringing balance to what we do in the here and now.
Thanks for your question.
Hi, my name's Eric. I'm a computer engineering student and house and dubstep music producer. And I just wanted to ask you, you said you're a chaplain at Harvard and you have that, I don't know what kind of building for that humanist building. I was wondering if you were able to get any kind of tax status equivalent to a regular religion, and if you did, how that process was.
Sure. Well, the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard, which has recently been renamed the Humanist Community at Harvard, though we are still a part of Harvard's sort of greater chaplaincy infrastructure, has existed for over 35 years. So it was created long before I was there, and I joined the staff only a couple of years ago. The sort of head humanist chaplain has been there for almost a decade now, and so I actually, fortunately, don't have to deal with a lot of that stuff, a lot of the sort of logistics and paperwork. More of my job is working directly with community members and doing sort of a lot of the organizing in the community and planning events. So I can't necessarily speak to that. I will say, so at Harvard there are nearly 40 different chaplains representing a variety of different worldviews, but none of the chaplains receive any funding from the university itself. All are independently funded, and many of the religious chaplaincies get funding from whatever body it is that they're affiliated with. As the humanist chaplaincy, we don't really have a body that we're affiliated with, and so we kind of have to do our own fundraising. And so all of the chaplaincies, ourselves included, are independent 501c3 nonprofits. And so we are a nonprofit, we raise our own funding, and I don't know that we, I guess the answer to your question is, and this is probably sort of embarrassing revelation, but I don't know whether we would be categorized in that way or not. I think in theory we could be. I don't think that we are, but I might be wrong. I'll have to put this on my to-do list to actually ask about this. But yeah, we're an independent 501c3.
One quick question to end.
Hi, my name is Sarah Burlingame, and I'm the director of religious education at a Unitarian church in Cheyenne. And I identify as queer and an atheist, but I really, really love Mormons.
Hello.
Like, this is like a revival for me. I want to be like your camp follower, Chris.
Oh, no, please, no. I'll follow you. We'll follow each other in a circle.
I'm in. Listening to you talk, I was reminded of a conversation I had with a friend, Ann Wild, and Ann Wild is a fundamentalist Mormon, and she's a former plural wife, and she runs an organization here in Utah that helps the state attorneys general reach out to polygamous families so that they have a link and a connection. And she's a really bold, amazing woman. But and I felt like we're traveling together, and like where I hit the wall was her insistence that whether they're based on, a foundation of patriarchy or whether they're based on a foundation of egalitarianism, it makes no difference in talking about how open to abuse those relationships are, and that actually they're analogous, like that there is no difference. And so in that conversation, I told her, I'm hitting a wall with you. I can't see that. And it discredits what you say to me. Like the rest of it, I feel skeptical, and I feel like I don't know if I can trust what you say because I can see that is not true. I can see that is a foundation for more abuse. And this is at Sunstone Conference. Everybody should go to. And it's a 3-day conference. And the following day, we met up again, and she said, I thought about what you said, and I feel like I always need to say that. I always need to be, there are so many voices saying plural families, polygamy, it's so dark, it's so evil, it's so abusive. I have got to push back against that. And it never occurred to me that people would discredit what I was saying because, I was actually glossing some, abuses that do happen. So I'm going to think about that, Sarah, and I think I'm going to change how I present that. And that was so radical to me to hear like this older woman who is, she's very gently strident about, she has to be the voice for so many people who feel like they can't talk, but she was so willing to hear that what was like radical for me was like, oh, okay, now where can I find that in myself? Like, what is the place that I could give a little? Like, where am I like, I'm sorry, I cannot, and really looked for that. So my question, I guess, is I want to hear if you've had those conversations where something really kind of foundational for you shifted and where you thought, oh, is that a place that I could give a little? Could I accommodate?
No, go ahead. I think our question is more directed to where you're coming.
Oh, sure. Well, I find that I have those conversations all the time. I find that I'm constantly unearthing barriers within myself toward better understanding and hearing and sympathizing with points of view that sort of diverge from my own. In fact, one of the 2 opening quotes at the beginning of Faithiest I'm actually going to read it because if I don't, I'll totally mangle it. But just one moment here. It's just so good, it's worth it. So the quote is from...
Are you one of your favorite authors?
Am I one of my favorite
Yes.
authors? No, I'm one of my least favorite authors. This is a quote from Rumi, and he says, "Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it." And I constantly find within myself these barriers that I was sort of completely unaware of. And points that I sort of, I think I like to think of myself as a progressive person, as someone who's willing to consider points of view other than my own and meet people more than halfway and be patient. And yet I find I constantly find myself falling short of my own highest principles. And one of the reasons why I am so passionate about engaging in really open, honest, and constructive interfaith dialogue is because it always presents opportunities for me to keep myself in check. It presents an opportunity for me, and this is, I think, true also of intra-community dialogue. It presents an opportunity for me to step outside of the sort of, the group of people that I sort of have selected for myself as the people that I want to spend the most amount of time around, my family, my closest friends, and so on and so forth. And it puts me into new spheres where I have to come across things that are going to push my own buttons, that are going to challenge me to think in new ways. And it keeps me from getting too comfortable in my own points of view. And so interfaith dialogue is important on a sort of sociological level because it will help us overcome a lot of the challenges that we face as a society. But it's also an important personal practice for me, because talking to people who I know do not share a lot of my views forces me to articulate to a group of people who don't necessarily always understand where I'm coming from, and to try to sort of explain in new ways and to come across things that are going to push my buttons that might not necessarily always get pushed if I just sort of exist in my own comfortable spaces. So, interfaith dialogue isn't just something that we should do in order to advance important discussions on a cultural level. I think it's also a really important personal practice. And some people might call that a faith practice or spiritual practice. And for me, it's just a practice in terms of trying to live a sort of holistic and a life that is, that in which I can actualize some of my highest aspirations, even if just for a moment in time. So thank you.
Amen.
Amen. That's fine. I'll allow it.
Wonderful. Thanks to both John and Chris, and please join me in thanking them. We'll just take a quick 5 or 6 minute break and come back for the final panel with all of the participants.